Within the reference guide to regulatory compliance, I left off on page 481 within subsection 3 deposits, the section on Reg CC, the availability of funds. And I am reading about exceptions to the normal availability schedules. In the last section, exception, specifically items where there is reasonable cause to doubt collectibility. A, if there is a reasonable cause to doubt the collectibility of an item, the case-by-case schedules for checks do not apply. B, the next day availability requirements for U.S. government checks drawn on a Federal Reserve Bank or Federal Home Loan Bank and certified cashiers and teller checks and checks not deposited in person do not apply. C, checks and electronic payments must receive next day availability. D, if the bank extends time for funds availability owing to doubts about the collectibility of an item and does not give the depositor a hold notice at the time of the deposit, it may not assess a fee for overdrafts if the overdrafts would not have occurred except for the delayed availability of funds and if the check was paid by a paying bank. E, the extension of time must be reasonable. An extension of up to 5 business days is deemed reasonable. A bank will have the burden of proving the reasonableness of longer extensions. F, the bank must keep records for 2 years of the notice provided to the customer and a statement of the facts that give rise to a bank's reason to doubt the collectibility of the item. Emergency conditions is another exception. In an emergency, holds may be placed on funds until a reasonable time after the emergency has passed, and emergencies include interruption of communications of computer and other equipment, suspension of payments by another bank, war, or emergencies beyond the control of the bank. The last exception would be the notice to customer of holds, or at least the exception notice must be given except for a new account or if the exception is due to an emergency when statutory exceptions are invoked. The notice must include, the exception notice that is, a number or code that need not exceed 4 digits and that identifies the customer's account, the date of the deposit, the amount that is delayed, the reason exception was invoked, and the date funds will be available for withdrawal except when, as a result of emergency conditions, the bank does not know the day the funds will be available. And timing of the exception notice must be given at the time of deposit unless the deposit is not made in person to a bank employee or facts that give rise to the exception being invoked do not come to the attention of the bank until later, in which case the bank must send notice by the next business day after facts become known. And lastly, the bank may give a one-time notice to non-customers regarding holds on large deposits or redeposited checks. Subsection 4, interest payments. A bank must begin to accrue interest on deposits made to an interest-bearing account on the day the bank receives credit for the funds. B, the bank may use availability schedule of the Federal Reserve Bank, Federal Home Loan Bank, or correspondent bank to determine when the funds are received. And C, the bank does not have to pay interest on deposits that are returned unpaid. Subsection 5, disclosures. The general requirements are that a disclosure must be clear, conspicuous, and in writing. If required to be given to a customer, it must be in the form the customer can keep, must be grouped together and separated from other information, must contain a statement that funds will be available for withdrawal on the blank business day after the day of deposit, no requirement for multiple disclosures, and the model disclosure in Appendix C to Regulation CC, which I read in a later section of this podcast. Initial disclosure statements are given to a customer before opening an account. The specific availability of funds policy is required, and it must reflect and summarize the bank policy. It must describe categories of deposits or checks used by the bank when availability of funds is delayed, must describe the bank's business days and when a deposit is considered to be received, must describe any exceptions that may be invoked by the bank and a statement that a customer will be notified if one is invoked, and must describe any case-by-case hold policy that may result in deposited funds being delayed. It also, lastly, must describe how the customer can differentiate between a proprietary and non-proprietary ATM if the bank delays the availability of deposits for longer times when the banks are made a non-proprietary ATM. A bank may, within disclosures, a bank may that generally makes funds available sooner than required by Reg CC may allow longer delays up to the time period allowed by the schedules on a case-by-case basis if it discloses this fact to the customer in the initial disclosure and also discloses that the bank will notify the customer if funds will be held for a longer time period, and the customer should ask if he or she needs to know about when a particular deposit will be available. Written notice at the time of the case-by-case delay must include a number or code that will not exceed 4 digits that identifies the customer's account, the date of the deposit, the amount of the deposit being delayed, and the day funds will be available. 2, no reason is required to be given for the delay. 3, must be given at the time of the deposit unless the deposit was made in person to a bank employee or unless the bank decides after the deposit was made to delay the funds availability. 4, this is the case-by-case delay requirements is if notice is not given at the time the deposit must be sent by the next business day after the day of deposit. And lastly, if the notice is not furnished at the time of the deposit, no fees for overdrafts may be assessed if the overdraft would not have occurred except for the delay of funds availability and the check was paid. However, overdraft fees may be assessed if the bank gives notice of such fees at the time of the notice of delayed funds is given and is willing to refund such fees on request. Other disclosures. 1, deposit slips must contain a statement that funds may not be available for immediate withdrawal. 2, the bank must post a notice where consumer deposits are received that sets forth the time period of delays of funds availability. 3, notices at ATM stating that funds may not be available for immediate withdrawal must be shown either by posting a sign posting the notice on the ATM screen or including it on the deposit envelopes provided at the ATM. I'm surprised it says or and or there and not and. Regardless, number 4, if deposits are not removed more than 2 times a week from the ATM, the bank must disclose at the ATM the days on which the deposits will be considered received. 5th, the bank's availability notice must be provided in person to any person upon request. And lastly, if the bank changes the availability policy, it must notify all holders of the consumer accounts at least 30 days before implementing the policy change unless the change expedites the availability of funds, in which case the notice may be given within 30 days after the change. Other requirements under Reg CC. Funds are considered to be deposited when received at a staff facility or ATM. 2, when received by the bank if mailed. 3, when removed from the night facility or lockbox. 4, when removed from an ATM not on or within 50 feet of the premises of the bank and the funds are not removed more than 2 times a week. And 5th, on the next banking day of deposit, if deposited on a non-banking day after a cutoff hour of 2 p.m. or later for on-premises deposits and 12 noon or later for off-premises deposits or ATMs. 2 p.m. is the cutoff time. Funds to be made available on a business day must be available by the later of 9 a.m. local time or when the bank's teller facilities are available for customer withdrawals. Banks may shorten the time funds are available before withdrawal, reject or accept a check for deposit, revoke a settlement made by the bank, and charge back the customer's account, open or make facilities available at its discretion, limit the cash withdrawals on any one day from accounts if the limitation is A, not dependent on the length of time the funds have been deposited, B, applied without discrimination to all bank customers, and C, related to security operations or bonding requirements. And lastly, banks may use calculated availability for non-consumer deposits if on average availability is as prompt as Reg CC requirements. Banks must establish procedures to ensure the bank is in compliance with Reg CC and that employees receive training on the requirements of the regulation. FERA penalties are up to $7,500 per day for violations of laws and regulations, or $37,500 per day if violations or unsafe or unsound practices are engaged in recklessly or are part of a pattern of misconduct that causes more than a minimal loss to the bank or any pecuniary gain to the parties involved. And penalties up to $1,375,000 per day against persons who knowingly commit a violation, knowingly or recklessly causes substantial loss to the bank or substantial benefit to the party. Under state laws, they require funds to be available sooner. They will supersede the Electronic Funds Availability Act and Reg CC requirements. Liabilities include actual damages, damages of not less than $100 or more than $1,000, class action damages of not more than $500,000 or 1% of the bank's net worth, whichever is less, or bona fide error defense. Record retention, you must keep evidence of compliance for 2 years. If a bank has notice of an investigation or enforcement proceeding involving records relating to the fund's availability, records must be kept until final disposition of the matter. Rules on the collection of checks and the return of checks, specifically subsection X. Paying bank is a bank by which, at which, or through which a check is payable. It must return checks in an expeditious manner. Checks are returned expeditiously if they are sent so that they would normally be received by the depository bank not later than 4 p.m. of the second business day after the day the check was presented to the paying bank if the paying bank is in the same check processing region, or not later than 4 p.m. of the fourth business day after the day the check was presented to the paying bank if the paying bank is not located in the same check processing region. This is probably going to change, this section right here. Expect that in the near future. Checks are also returned expeditiously if the bank sends the return check in a manner that a similarly situated bank would normally handle a check of the same amount drawn on the depository bank and deposited for forward collection by the similarly situated bank by noon of the banking business day after the check was deposited. A paying bank returning a check must clearly indicate on the front of the check that it is a return check and the reason for the return. If a bank cannot identify the depository bank, it may send the check to any bank that handled the check for forward collection, and the requirements to return expeditiously do not apply. Time deadlines of the Uniform Commercial Code, or Reg J, will be extended if a bank uses an expedited delivery method and the check is received before the receiving bank's next business day. If a highly expeditious means is used, the deadline is further extended and the check does not have to arrive before the next business day. A bank returning a check must clearly state on the face of the check the reason for its return. If the check is a substitute check, the paying bank must place this information within the image of the original check that appears on the front of the substitute check. Expeditious return rules do not apply to checks deposited with banks not maintaining accounts. A bank may send a copy of the front and back of the check or notice of non-payment if the check is available for return. A bank may return a check based on routing numbers in the depository bank's endorsement. Returning bank responsibilities. Part B. If the returning bank is a bank other than a paying bank that handles a return check, it must handle checks in an expeditious manner. Checks are returned expeditiously if they are sent so that they would normally be received by the depository bank not later than 4 p.m. of the second day after the day the check was presented to the paying bank, provided the paying bank is in the same check processing region, or be received by 4 p.m. of the fourth business day after the day the check was presented to the paying bank and the paying bank is not located in the same check processing region. A check is also returned expeditiously if the bank sends a return check in the manner that a similarly situated bank would normally handle a check of the same amount drawn on the depository bank and received for forward collection by the similarly situated bank at the same time the returning bank received the check. A returning bank unable to identify the depository bank may send the check to any collecting bank that handled the check to or to a prior collecting bank. A returning bank must settle with a bank sending a return check in the same manner it settles with the sending bank for the check sent for forward collection. Returning banks may charge a fee for handling return checks. Expeditious return rules do not apply to checks deposited with banks not maintaining accounts. A returning bank may send a copy of the check or notice of non-payment if the check is unavailable for return, and a bank may return a check based on routing numbers in the depository bank's endorsement. Depository bank responsibilities are listed here. 1. A depository bank is the first bank to which the check is transferred, even though it is also the paying bank or the payee. The depository bank must accept return checks and written notices of non-payment at the location at which the presentment of checks for forward collection is requested by the depository bank. At the branch or other location consistent with its name and address in the endorsement. If no address is on the endorsement, at the branch located with its routing number. If no routing number is on the check, and at any branch or head office of the bank. The depository bank must pay the paying bank or returning bank the amount of the check by the close of business on the day it receives the check by debit to its account on the books of the returning or paying bank, cash, wire transfer, or any other payment form acceptable to the returning bank or bank. Misrouted return checks and notices of non-payment must be returned promptly to the depository bank or the bank from which they were received. The depository bank may charge a fee for accepting and paying checks. Next sections would include notice of non-payment, warranties given by paying and returning banks, endorsement rules, presentment of checks, and liability before we get into substitute checks.